Once upon a time there lived a man, Mr. Kim, in a village in Korea. He was rich but not generous, and people often went to him to borrow money. But they have to pay back by any means, no exception, no excuse. Mr. Kim often bragged to his friend, you know, if someone borrowed money from me and he ran away, I could chase him to the end of the world. I never give up my money. And there lived another man, Mr. Park, in the neighborhood. He heard Mr. Kim's reputation and he didn't like Mr. Kim's bragging. And he thought, I will borrow some money from him and I will not pay back. Let's see who wins. And he went to Mr. Kim and borrowed 100 ryang. It's not big money, but it's some money. And for a month, it's due, in a month, it's due to pay back. So as the due day came closer, one afternoon, Mr. Park called out his son and said, my son, go to the funeral shop and buy a wooden coffin for me and prepare funeral service for me. His son was puzzled. Father, you are not dead. Why your funeral? Just do it as I told you. So his son prepared a coffin and he put on the yellow hemp clothes, the gown and hat to be a mourner. And Mr. Park said, now go around and spread the word. Your father died yesterday. So his son did. And Mr. Kim, of course, heard the news and he thought, oh, the other day I saw Mr. Park. He was well. And how could he die overnight? And he hurried to Mr. Park's house. And Mr. Park's son greeted, putting on the mourner's clothes. And as the Korean funeral culture did, he just, 아이고, 아이고, 아이고. It means I'm so sad. So Mr. Kim, he couldn't demand his money. Instead, he expressed a polite condolence to Mr. Park's son, and he came back. That night he thought, how could Mr. Park die before he paid my money back? I have an idea. I will get back my money. And the next morning he went to the kitchen and picked up a knife and sharpened its blade, zigzag, zigzag, and wrapped the blade with cloth and kept it in his coat. And he hurried to Mr. Park's house again. At the gate, he met Mr. Park's son, and he said, your father borrowed 100 ryang from me, and he didn't pay back. So you have to pay your father's debt. Mr. Park's son refused. He said, oh, I've never heard about the money from my dad. How could I believe it? I can't pay back the money. Mr. Kim now was furious and he said, all right, if you refuse, then I have my own way to get my share. So he took out the knife and he went to the room where Mr. Park's coffin was kept, and he just began to uncover the lid. Mr. Park's son ran after him and held his hand and pleaded, please stop it. Let my father be dead in peace. And it's no use for you to take my father's flesh. I will pay back my father's money. So leave him now. And Mr. Kim said, bring it right now. But Mr. Park's son begged, after the funeral service done, I will pay back, I promise. So Mr. Kim went home. Mr. Park heard the conversation between his son and Mr. Kim in the coffin, and he came out and said to his son, now go around the neighbor again and tell them your father came back from the land of dead. He's now alive. So his son did. And Mr. Kim, of course, heard the news, and he was really surprised. How could a man could come back from the land of dead? So he just hurried to Mr. Park's house. And surprisingly, Mr. Park was sitting in the room and greeted Mr. Kim. Oh, Mr. Kim, how are you? Mr. Park, I heard you were dead. How could you come back? Oh, yes, the great king of the dead. He found there's mistake. He said, my turn was not yet, so I have to come back to my house. That's how I came here again. Mr. Kim was now curious about the land of dead, so he asked, what was it like, the land of dead and the house that people live there? Mr. Park, I realized I have to pay back all the money before I die, because in the land of dead, if you are a borrower, oh, it's terrible. So Mr. Kim was curious. What did they do to the borrowers? Yes, when the lender came, he could beat the borrower until he paid back. So, you know what? When I came back, I saw at the corner a man was beating an old man with a big stick. An old man just cried and screamed with pain. Oh, he looked so miserable. So I asked why. And they said the old man was borrower. He didn't pay back the money. One more thing. The old man's face was very familiar to me. Mr. Kim was more curious. Who was he? Did you know him? Was he our neighbor? Oh, yes, yes. And Mr. Park came closer to Mr. Kim and whispered, it was your late dad. What? No, it can't be. It's not true. Yes, yes. Your father borrowed 200 liang from the man, and before he paid back, he died. That's why he was suffering so much. I felt so sorry for your father, and fortunately, I got 200 liang in my pocket. My considerate son prepared for me when I died. So I paid back your father's debt, and he was freed. Oh, your father was so glad, and he was grateful to me. He said, Mr. Kim, thank you so much. When you come back to your house, go to my son and tell him, pay back this 200 nyang. It's father's word. Tell him. Mr. Kim now heard this and really embarrassed and shameful and still suspicious. But what can he do? Because in those days, a son should respect his father's word even after his father had died. So Mr. Kim now he had to pay back the money to Mr. Bob, and Mr. Bob laughed and said, "Oh, but you don't have to pay me back because I already borrowed 100 ryang from you and I didn't pay back on due day. So I gave you a lot of trouble. So let's make it even. Just your money, my money, you know, let's clean. Okay?" And Mr. Kim now was very grateful for the offer. And he said, "Thank you, Mr. Park." And he showed just humility. And he went back home with an empty hand. So Mr. Park looked at the Mr. Kim's living and, okay, maybe he learned a humility.